The gunshot cracked through the frozen night like a fist through glass. Lian Zhao stood motionless in the kitchen doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Across the room, Colt Harlan, the quiet rancher she had cooked for these past 3 months, the man who stacked firewood outside her door every single evening without ever being asked, pressed the barrel of his rifle flush against Rex Dunmore's throat with a stillness that was more frightening than any rage could have been. Blood darkened the snow just beyond the open door. The other men had drawn their weapons. One wrong word, one nervous finger, and the room would detonate. But what truly froze the blood in Lian's veins was not the guns, not the violence, not even the absolute zero of Colt's expression. It was the realization that she had been living beside a darkness she had never once imagined, and that somewhere beneath that darkness, she still trusted him completely. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story travels. And if you want to know how a Chinese cook and a silent rancher found each other in the brutal heart of Wyoming winter, hit that like button and stay until the very end. The stagecoach deposited Lian Zhao at the gate of Stone Ridge Ranch on the last Tuesday of November 1885 in the middle of what the driver generously called a light dusting, which was by any honest accounting 4 inches of new snow with more falling, hard out of a sky the color of old pewter. The driver did not help her down. He tossed her travel bag onto the frozen ground, said, "Stone Ridge," in the tone of a man confirming an address on a death certificate, and then clicked his horses forward and disappeared into the gray afternoon as though he had never existed at all. Lynn stood alone in the vast white silence of the Wyoming frontier and did what she had learned to do in the year and a half since arriving in America, she assessed. The main house rose at the end of a packed dirt drive that snow had reduced to a vague, pale suggestion. Dark timber and pale stone wide and low, and built into the hillside with a permanence that spoke of a man who intended to stay. 2 chimneys threw smoke into the afternoon air. Beyond the house, the outbuildings stretched toward distant mountains, a massive barn painted rust red, a long bunkhouse with yellow light in its windows, equipment sheds, corrals. Everything was weathered to the same shade of honest use. Nothing was decorative. Everything was functional. She picked up her bag. The weight of it was familiar, in particular, not heavy with clothes or money, but with everything that remained of a life. Inside, wrapped in a square of silk that had once been a good color, were her mother's cooking knives. A small cedar box held dried herbs and prepared remedies, each packet labeled in her grandmother's careful hand. 2 changes of clothes, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, a piece of carved green jade, the last thing her father had pressed into her palm the morning the fever first took him 3 years ago in Guangdong, when they had both still believed he would recover. She had crossed an ocean and half a continent with this bag. She had slept sitting up in steerage for 6 weeks with this bag. She had talked her way into a job at a rooming house in San Francisco with this bag, then another job, then a reference letter, and then an employment agency that placed domestic workers on frontier ranches. She was not about to set it down now. The ranch house door opened. The man on the porch was tall, built the way the mountains behind him were built, all hard angles, stripped of anything superfluous by years of weather and hard work. Dark wool coat worn leather at the elbows and knees, a wide-brimmed hat that put his face in partial shadow. What she could see was a jaw like a blade edge and eyes that were doing what every pair of American eyes did when they first encountered her, taking inventory. Female. Small, she would be generous and call herself 5 feet. Young, foreign, alone. She had long since stopped being wounded by that inventory. She simply returned it. "Miss Zhao," he said. His voice was the sound of something heavy being dragged across frozen ground, not unkind but not bothered with softness either. He did not make it a question. "Yes." She kept her spine straight, her chin up, the same posture her mother had insisted on. "People treat you as you present yourself, Lion. Present yourself as someone worth treating well. I am Lian Zhao. You are Mr. Harlan." "Colt." His eyes moved past her, briefly checking the road, then came back. "You understand the terms of the contract." It was not a question either. She answered it anyway. "Winter season, room, board, and wages. Cooking for yourself and 10 ranch hands. Conditions will be hard. The men are rough." She paused. "I did not come to Wyoming expecting refinement, Mr. Harlan." Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but a recalibration, a fraction of the assessment revised. "Colt," he said again. "Colt," she agreed. He turned and went inside without another word, and she followed. The kitchen was a disaster. Lian had cooked in a San Francisco rooming house kitchen that had been shared among 12 women with conflicting ideas about cleanliness. She had cooked in a cattle drover's camp out of the back of a supply wagon during a 3-day job that paid almost nothing. She had cooked in a mining camp cook shack in Nevada for 2 weeks before the foreman's wife arrived and decided she didn't want a Chinese woman handling food for her husband. She knew what bad kitchens looked like. This was worse. The cast iron stove was magnificent, a great black beast of a thing properly sized for feeding a dozen men, but its surfaces were furred with grease and burned on residue that suggested months of neglect. The counters held encrusted pans stacked with no-logic muddy boot prints tracked directly across them. The shelves were a geological record of a household without a cook, tins piled on sacks, piled on jars, a chaos of provisions that told the story of men feeding themselves by pure stubbornness. The previous cook left in October, Colt said from the doorway. His voice was careful, like someone admitting fault without exactly apologizing for it. How long ago did the last proper meal happen in this kitchen? A pause. Define proper, hot, intentional, not burned. October, he said again, and this time it carried the full weight of confession. Lian set her bag down carefully on the cleanest 6 inches of counter she could identify. She turned to face him. When do the men expect dinner? He pulled a pocket watch from his vest. Old, well-maintained, the case worn smooth. Sundown, about 2 hours. 2 hours to transform this wreckage into something that would feed 11 hungry, skeptical men. She looked at the stove. She looked at the shelves. She did the mathematics of what she had and what she could build from it. I will need the stove hot and water heating immediately, she said. And whatever you have in the cold room, all of it, let me see it. Colt moved without hesitation. He built up the fire in the stove with the efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times, then began filling a large pot from the hand pump, while Lian opened every cupboard and took mental inventory. Dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal flour, tins of preserved things, molasses. The cold room off the back of the kitchen held potatoes, onions, a slab of bacon, and unexpectedly, wonderfully 3 whole chickens, hard frozen, but intact. She had worked with less. Do you have any herbs? She asked. Dried thyme sage, anything like that. He looked at the shelves with the expression of a man who had never once thought about herbs. There might be something on the... He stopped, found a small tin pushed to the back of the highest shelf, opened it, sniffed. Thyme, old but maybe still good. Good enough. She was already moving, clearing one section of counter with systematic purpose, scrubbing it down with the heating water and soap from beneath the sink. A clean workspace first. Everything else followed from that. It was the first lesson her mother had ever taught her about cooking. You cannot build good things in a dirty space. Colt carried the frozen chickens in from the cold room and set them on her freshly cleaned counter without being asked. Then he leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, and watched her work with an attention that was curious rather than intrusive. Most American men she had encountered seemed constitutionally unable to occupy the same space as a woman doing skilled work without offering unsolicited opinions. Colt Harlan simply watched his expression, thoughtful, saying nothing. She broke down the chickens with her mother's cleaver, the good one, the one with the bone handle worn smooth and dark from 50 years of use. The frozen flesh resisted, but the blade was sharp and her technique was certain. She set the pieces to simmer in a pot with water, salt, and 1-star anise from her personal supply. I should warn you, Colt said after a while, the men are going to be skeptical. Lian didn't pause her work. Skeptical of me or of the food? Both, of change in general. They've been eating beans and cornbread made badly for 6 weeks and they've decided it's normal. What do you expect? She glanced at him briefly. From tonight, honestly. He seemed genuinely surprised by the question. He was quiet for a moment, thinking it over, rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. I expect, he said finally, that you'll either prove them wrong or you won't. Either way, I'll know by tomorrow. It was blunt and true, and she appreciated it more than any reassurance would have been. Then you will know the right answer by tomorrow, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one there, and gone before she could be certain. He left her to it. Lynn worked in focused silence, moving through the kitchen the way she always moved through crisis, methodically without haste, each action chosen with purpose. She rendered the bacon until the fat ran clear, used it to saute the onions until they turned translucent and sweet, then browned the chicken pieces in batches until the skin crisped and pulled away from the bone. She built the stew, gradually brothed carrots, cut uniform potatoes, chunked large cabbage, shredded fine, and adjusted the seasoning with the patience her mother had spent years teaching her. A splash of vinegar to lift the fat, molasses just a spoonful to add something that suggested warmth without announcing itself. The dried thyme crumbled between her palms to wake whatever life remained in it. While the stew simmered, she tackled the cornbread. She found buttermilk in the cold room, forgotten probably, but preserved by the freezing temperatures, and made a large batch enriched with extra eggs and bacon fat poured into cast iron skillets she had scrubbed back to black. By the time she rang the bell on the porch, the kitchen smelled like a kitchen again, like intention, like care. The ranch hands filed in from the bunkhouse in a loose column, stamping snow from their boots in the entry. 10 men ranging from barely 20 to weathered 50, all of them lean and work-hardened, all of them looking at Lian with the same careful assessment she had become accustomed to, except that here the assessment was not of her race or her foreignness. It was the focused evaluation of men who were very hungry and had been disappointed before. Colt was already seated at the head of the long table. He said nothing. Just eat. The serving dish went down. Steam rose, carrying the smell of the stew. The cornbread came next, golden brown, still warm. The first man to reach for the stew was an older hand with gray in his beard, and the weathered caution of a man who had been on the frontier long enough to expect bad things. He spooned it into his bowl, took a piece of cornbread, and ate with the deliberate attention of someone performing a formal evaluation. His spoon went back into the bowl before he had swallowed the first bite. The change moved down the table like a wave, spoons finding bowls, bowls finding mouths, and the careful skepticism dissolving not slowly, not gradually, but with the sudden unanimity of men confronted with something undeniable. "Holy hell," said one of the young ones. His name was Finn. She would later learn, barely 20, all freckles and earnestness. "This is actual food." "Better than actual food," said the one beside him, Cody, 18, who had the look of a boy who had recently discovered he was becoming a man and wasn't sure how he felt about it. "This is the best thing I've eaten since my ma's table." Lian allowed herself a small, private smile. She retreated to the kitchen and began cleaning the cooking pots, listening to the sound of hungry men eating well. A sound she had grown up with, a sound that had meant home and safety and abundance long before she understood what any of those things could be lost. The pots were only half cleaned when Colt appeared in the doorway, his empty bowl in hand, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "They're asking for seconds," he said. "There is plenty. And they want to know if you're staying." She met his eyes steadily. "That depends. Am I?" He set the bowl on the counter. "Miss Zhao," he said, the formality returned, but different now, weighted with something like sincerity. "If you're willing to cook like that through the winter, you can stay as long as you want. That's a promise." From the dining room, she heard his voice announcing her hire, heard the immediate chorus of approval, boots on the floor, spoons on the table, the raw celebration of men who had been eating badly for 6 weeks and had just been told it was over. Lian turned back to her pots and scrubbed them clean in water that had gone cold. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick and steady, blanking the world to white. The mountains disappeared. The distant corrals disappeared. The ranch contracted to its circle of warm lamplight, and inside that circle, Lian felt something she had not felt in longer than she could name. Not safe, not yet, but something pointed in that direction. A possibility. Gaia. She woke before dawn the next morning, in the small room off the kitchen that was now hers. Narrow bed, chest of drawers, a washstand, and walls that held the warmth from the stove like a held breath. The room was plain to the point of severity, but it had a door she could close, and behind a closed door, she could exist without performance, without vigilance. She had not understood until she lay down in it how exhausted she was from 2 years of never being allowed to simply be still. She dressed in the dark. She had learned to do this in the rooming house, where one candle was shared among 4 women on night shifts, and walked into the kitchen to find Colt already there building the fire. He looked up from the stove, but didn't seem surprised to see her. "You don't have to start this early. Men don't expect breakfast until sunup." If I start now, breakfast will be better. She began pulling out supplies. Do you want coffee? A pause that might have been surprise. I usually make it about now. I'll make it. She found the coffee tin, measured grounds with the careful attention of someone who understood that good coffee was not an accident. While the water heated, she began biscuit, dough flour, large salt buttermilk, working it with her hands until the texture was right. Her mother's method, which was her grandmother's method, which was the accumulated knowledge of women who had cooked for families through wars and floods and famine and understood that good food in the morning made everything else more survivable. Where did you learn to cook? Colt asked. He had settled at the table with his coffee, watching her work with that same thoughtful attention from the night before. My mother, and her mother before her. She accepted the cup he slid across the table and cradled it in both hands. In my family, cooking was the language of care. When you wanted to tell someone they mattered to you, you fed them something made with attention. He absorbed this. Your family is still in China. My family is gone. She said it simply the way she had learned to say it, not with the flattened affect of someone suppressing pain, but with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone who had metabolized grief into something she could carry. Fever 3 years ago, my parents within weeks of each other. My grandmother had already died the winter before. I'm sorry. Thank you. They were quiet for a moment. Lian cut out biscuits with the rim of a tin cup, spacing them on the greased sheet with the geometric precision that was she had been told very Chinese of her, and was also, she knew, simply correct. What about your family? She asked. Are they in Wyoming? The quality of the silence changed. No family, he said. The words were clipped, not hostile, but closed. The tone of someone who had said this many times and had learned that brevity discouraged questions better than any other approach. She respected it. She recognized it. Everyone carried their own closed rooms. Yeah. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Lion woke before dawn, cooked breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, prepared the midday meal for the hands to take to the pastures, cooked dinner at sundown. Between meals, she dismantled the kitchen's chaos with methodical patience, scrubbing every surface, organizing supply by logic rather than accident, identifying what was spoiled and what was salvageable, requesting what was needed from Colt. He provided everything without argument and without asking why she wanted it, which she noted. The ranch hands warmed to her faster than she had expected. Within 2 weeks, they were lingering after meals, laughing among themselves, calling out requests from the bunkhouse porch when they smelled something good on the wind. Finn and Cody, the two youngest, barely old enough to shave in Cody's case, began drifting into the kitchen in off hours, watching her work with the open curiosity of young men who had realized perhaps for the first time that cooking was a skill rather than something that simply happened. Miss Zhao, Finn said one afternoon, hovering near the counter where she was teaching herself to work with the unfamiliar American oven. How do you know how much of everything to put in? Practice, she said, and paying attention. The food tells you what it needs if you're listening. Cody, who was shelling dried beans at the table with more care than the task required, looked up. Can you teach us some of it? She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Her grandmother had believed knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted. Her mother had taught any neighbor who asked. If you follow instructions exactly, she said finally, I will teach you. Yes, ma'am. They said together with the sincere earnestness of young men who had decided something mattered. Colt observed all of this from a careful distance. He ate with the hands which she had not expected from an employer, and he served himself last, which she noticed. He worked alongside his men in the pastures and corrals rather than supervising from horseback, which she learned from the older hands' casual comments. He asked for nothing expected, only that the work be done, and gave credit for it quietly. He was in the language of the frontier. She was slowly learning to read a good man, which meant something more specific here than it did elsewhere. It meant he did what he said, paid what he owed, and did not abuse what he was trusted with. He was also utterly alone in a way she recognized because she lived it herself. She started leaving small offerings not out of strategy, not from calculation, but from the same instinct that had made her grandmother put extra ginger in the tea when someone looked tired. A plate kept warm on the back of the stove for the nights Colt came in late from the pastures. Coffee ready when he appeared before dawn. His work shirts mended when she found them torn and left by the wash basin. She did these things quietly without announcement. He responded in his own quiet language. Firewood appeared outside her door each evening, enough to keep the cold from her room through the night. A loose board in her floor was repaired one afternoon while she was in the kitchen. She found it solid beneath her foot and no explanation offered. When the cold snap deepened and her room grew frigid despite the stove's proximity, he appeared with an oil heater and installed it without ceremony. "You'll freeze otherwise," he said. "Thank you, Colt." He paused in the doorway. Just Colt, he said, and she understood that some threshold had been crossed, that the formal distance of employer and employee had just been replaced by something harder to name. You can call me Colt. Then you should call me Lian." He looked at her for a long moment with his dark, careful eyes. Then he nodded once and pulled the door closed behind him, and she stood alone in the warming room with her heart beating slightly faster than usual and no particular explanation for it. The first time she heard about Clara Harlan, she was in the general store in Ridgecross, the nearest town, a 3-hour wagon ride in good weather standing at the dry goods counter while Colt was at the bank. The shopkeeper's name was Ned Cartwright, a wide-faced man of 50 with the warm indiscretion of someone who had operated a telegraph office adjacent to his store for 20 years and had consequently forgotten that not all information was meant to be shared. "You're the cook out at Stone Ridge," he said, half statement and half question, while she examined a selection of spices. "Heard good things. Heard you're settling in." "I'm settling in. Well, thank you. Good ranch. Good man Colt Harlan." He paused, arranging a display of tobacco tins with unnecessary care. "Been a hard few years for him, though. What with, well, you probably know." "I don't actually." She looked up. Ned Cartwright studied the tobacco tins with sudden intense focus. "His wife," he said carefully. "Clara, she went missing about 3 years back. November, same as well." He cleared his throat. "Nobody knows what happened. She just one morning she wasn't there. He looked for her, or said he did. Sheriff Briggs looked too for a while." He paused. "People talk is all I'm saying. In a town this size, people will talk." "What do people say, eh?" He looked up at her with the expression of a man who has said too much and is trying to figure out how to say less. "Nothing that's been proven," he said carefully. "Nothing official." He went back to the tobacco tins. "Just you'd be wise to know the water you're swimming in, Miss Zhao. That's all I meant." She bought her spices. She folded the information into the back of her mind and carried it with her like a stone in a coat pocket, present, weighty, impossible to forget, but not yet anything she knew what to do with. When Colt helped her back up onto the wagon seat and clicked the horses forward into the pale afternoon, she looked at the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and she thought, "I do not know this man. I know his habits, his kindnesses, his silences. I do not know his history." And somewhere beneath that thought, quieter and more troubling, "And yet I trust him, even now, even not knowing." She filed that away too and rode beside him in silence through the snow-thick afternoon and said nothing about what she had learned. The blizzard arrived 12 days after the trip to town, striking, without the full warning the sky usually gave. One afternoon, the temperature simply fell off a cliff. Wind came from the north with a sound like something furious, and within an hour, the world beyond the ranch house windows had ceased to exist. Colt called everyone in immediately. By the time the last ranch hand had stumbled through the door, ice had already formed in the beards of the slower ones, and the thermometer outside the kitchen window showed a temperature that had no name in the languages she had grown up speaking. "Days," Colt said, studying the sky from the porch with the evaluative grimness of a man who had survived Wyoming winters before and knew better than to underestimate them. "Maybe a week. Settle in." Lian assessed her supplies with the methodical calm that had become her default response to crisis. Enough food barely if stretched carefully. She began planning soups heavy on beans and grain stews where vegetables did the work of meat bread made from mixed flours to conserve the good wheat. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury for people who had not already survived worse. For the first 2 days, the ranch hands adapted with reasonable, good cheer cards at the dining table stories. By the fire, the cabin fever restlessness of men who worked with their bodies subdued by walls and weather. Lian cooked, kept the stove running, maintained a constant supply of coffee and tea, and listened to the storm beat itself against the house with a steady, indifferent fury. On the second evening, she noticed that Finn's face was flushed in a way that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. By morning, both Finn and Cody were burning. Lynn recognized influenza. She had watched it move through a San Francisco neighborhood the previous year, taking people with a speed that had seemed almost personal. She recognized the particular quality of the fever climbing fast with a shivering that came from deep in the bones rather than from cold, and she recognized the hollow look behind the boy's eyes. That meant the body had begun redirecting all available resources toward survival. The docks in Ridgecross, one of the older hands said, his voice carefully neutral. 3 hours in good weather. Could be a day in this. Then we treat them here. She was already moving, pulling the cedar box from its place on the kitchen shelf. I need water boiling and clean cloths as many as you have. Colt was in the doorway. She looked at him directly. My grandmother was a healer. She taught me what she knew. I can help them. I will need space and cooperation and for no one to interfere. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then what else do you need? Someone strong to help me move them to the ground floor. And privacy. He organized it without another word, moving the boys to the 2 ground floor guest rooms, building fires, in both posting men to keep the wood supply constant. Lian set up her workspace in the kitchen, measuring out willow bark for the fevers, ginger for the nausea, honeysuckle for the infection. She could already smell building in Cody's chest. Licorice root to ease the inflamed throat she could see when he tried to swallow. Her grandmother's voice thin but precise across the years. Medicine is balance. Too much of any one thing tips the scale toward harm. Find the middle path and hold it. She made the teas with exacting care, portioned them into cups, went between the 2 rooms every 2 hours, with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that time spent not acting was time the fever was spending, acting instead. She changed the compresses on their foreheads. She made chest poultices from heated cloths and prepared herbs that would release their medicine through the skin. She talked to the boys when they were awake, sometimes in English, sometimes in the language of her childhood, when English felt too foreign for the intimacy of sickbed conversation, and sat in silence when they were not. Colt worked beside her. This surprised her, and then it didn't. He changed bedding when the fever sweat soaked through. He held Finn still when the delirium made the boy thrash and try to get up. He carried hot water when she needed it and cool water when she needed that. He never questioned her methods, never suggested she was wasting time, never looked at the herbs with the skepticism she had braced herself for from the moment she opened the cedar box. On the 3rd night, she found him sitting in the chair beside Finn's bed at 3 in the morning, his elbows on his knees, his face in his hands, and she understood that it was not obligation keeping him here. These were not employees to him. They were something closer. She set a cup of tea on the table beside him and sat down in the other chair. They didn't speak. The fire crackled. Finn breathed with the wet, labored sound of a chest fighting itself. Outside, the blizzard hammered at the walls with tireless, impersonal fury. Inside, in the small, warm circle of the firelight, Lion and Colt sat in silence until the eastern sky began to lighten. She was nearly asleep in the chair when she felt his hand cover hers. Not squeezing, not demanding, just resting there warm and deliberate, the way you'd place a hand on something to keep it from being lost. She turned her hand over beneath his slowly, and their fingers found each other in the dark. Neither of them said anything. The storm spoke for them, and the fire and the sound of a sick boy breathing, labored but rhythmic, still alive, still fighting. Cody's fever broke on the 4th day. Finn's climbed. For 12 hours, Lian fought the most frightening battle of her life with nothing but dried plants and boiling water, and her grandmother's voice in her memory and the steady presence of a man who had not slept more than a few hours in 4 days and showed no signs of leaving. She increased the strength of the willow bark, changed the chest poultice every hour, sat by Finn's bed, and spoke to him in the quiet, continuous way she had been told the near-dying could sometimes still hear. You are going to be fine, she said in English, and in Cantonese and back again. Your mother raised you better than to die in a blizzard, Finn. She would be very disappointed. At dawn on the 5th day, Finn's fever broke. Lian was sitting by his bed when it happened. She felt it the way you feel the moment a storm breaks, a change in the air, a loosening. His skin went from dry and burning to cool and damp. His breathing changed. His eyes, when they opened, were clouded but clear. No delirium, just exhaustion and the mild bewilderment of the recently ill. Miss Zhao, his voice was a ruin. What happened? You were sick, she said. You are better now. Go back to sleep. He obeyed without argument. She put her face in her hands and allowed herself for exactly 30 seconds to shake. Colt found her there when he came in with morning coffee. He set the cup on the table, and then he did something she had not expected. He crouched down in front of her, brought himself to her eye level, and waited until she looked up. "You saved them," he said. "Both of them. We saved them." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I could not have done it alone." "Lian," he said her name with an attention that made it feel like something being carefully handled. "Your grandmother would be proud." The gentleness of it, the absolute unguarded gentleness, cracked something open in her chest that she had been keeping sealed for 3 years. Tears came before she could stop them, and she turned away quickly, pressing her hands to her mouth. She felt his hands settle on her shoulder. Brief warm, the same deliberate steadiness as the night in the dark beside Finn's bed. Then he stood and gave her the privacy of the room, and she cried for her grandmother who had given her everything she needed without knowing that one day it would save lives in a Wyoming winter, and for her parents who would never see her here, and for herself for the long, relentless effort of becoming a someone who could survive without them. When it was done, she dried her face, straightened her spine, and went to make breakfast, because that was what survivors did. They kept moving. Forward was the only direction that mattered. The blizzard ended on the 6th day. The ranch had survived. Finn and Cody were recovering, weak, humbled, and embarrassingly grateful in the way of young men who have recently understood their own mortality. The other hands had somehow escaped the illness. The cattle count came back short, 40 head lost to ravines and cold, and the mood at dinner that evening was subdued, the quietness of people who had gotten through something and were still too close to it to feel the relief. Lian made dumplings, the last of the good flour dried mushrooms she had been saving for something that mattered enough. She made soup rich with mushroom broth, ginger and garlic, the kind of warmth that started in the belly and spread outward. The men ate in quiet appreciation. Colt ate without speaking, but he looked at her across the table, but once with an expression she was beginning to learn, dark, direct, saying more than he was willing to say out loud. Later, when she was cleaning the kitchen, he came in with firewood. "The men want to take up a collection," he said, "extra pay for Finn and Cody." "That isn't necessary. They know that. They want to do it anyway." She considered this, then nodded. "If it matters to them, let them." He stacked the wood and straightened and did not immediately leave. The kitchen was very quiet. "You're not what I expected," he said finally, "when I hired you." "What did you expect? Someone temporary, someone who'd last the winter and leave in spring." He looked at the fire rather than at her. "Instead, I got someone who makes this place feel less empty." The words landed somewhere soft. She turned to face him. "The ranch was empty before I came." "The ranch has always been empty." He paused. "I just didn't notice until I had something to compare it to." The silence held something fragile and new between them. "It feels less empty to me now, too," she said softly. Their eyes met, and she saw in his face the same recognition she felt in her own chest. Two people who had spent years constructing efficient solitudes, finding each other in the middle of a Wyoming winter and discovering cautiously that maybe the walls didn't have to stay. Colt cleared his throat. "I should check on the horses." "Good night, Colt." "Good night, Lian." He left. She stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the house settle around her, and thought about how strange it was that belonging, the feeling of it, the possibility of it, didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly in the middle of ordinary things, and you only recognized it by the way it changed the quality of the silence. Cody and Finn recovered in stages, first the fever's retreat, then the slow return of appetite, then the gradual restoration of their particular brands of good cheer that arrived in both cases with the sheepishness of young men who had accepted a great deal of help and were not sure how to carry that gracefully. "I'm not good at this," Finn said on the 3rd day of his recovery, sitting upright in bed while Lian changed his morning compress, a formality now his skin cool and normal beneath her palm, but routine had its own medicine. "Being taken care of. My ma would say that about me. Finn, you accept help like a cat accepts a bath." "Most men are the same," Lian said, wringing out the cloth over the basin. "They believe accepting help is the same as admitting weakness. Isn't it?" "No, Punjao." She replaced the compress with the dry cloth. Accepting help is admitting you're human. Only a fool confuses those two things. She paused. Drink your tea, all of it. He drank his tea with the resigned obedience of the recently humbled. The ranch settled back into its routines with the gradual ease of a house recovering from illness itself cautiously at first, then with more confidence as the days passed and no one else showed symptoms. The cold remained fierce, the snow lay deep and permanent, but the worst of the blizzard season felt like it had broken something and left clearer air behind. Lian was repairing the kitchen stove's firebox door. The hinge had begun to stick during the blizzard's most intense cold, and she had taken to adjusting it with a rag to protect her fingers when she found it. She had removed the door entirely to examine the hinge mechanism, setting it on the counter beside her tools. When she leaned into the firebox to examine the hinge plate, her lantern threw light into the back corner she had never had reason to illuminate before, and she saw the edge of paper. She almost dismissed it. Receipts, probably some previous cook's record-keeping, tucked into the warmest available space to protect from damp. She reached in anyway, fingers careful, and drew out a bundle of 4 letters folded together and tied with a piece of kitchen twine that had gone gray with age and heat. She should have replaced them immediately. She knew that. She looked at the handwriting on the topmost letter, a woman's careful script, the ink faded but legible. RD was all the address, read no full name, nothing else. RD Rex Dunmore. She put the letters down on the counter. She replaced the firebox door. She finished the repair she had set out to do, tested the hinge, wiped down the stove, and washed her hands at the basin. She stood at the counter for a long moment looking at the tied bundle. Then she sat down and read them. The first letter was dated November 1882. It was written in the careful, slightly formal English of a woman who had been educated, but who wrote personal letters with effort, choosing each word. The name at the bottom was Clara. It took Lian 2 readings to understand what she was holding. Clara Harlan Colt's wife had been writing to Rex Dunmore for at least a year before her disappearance. The letters were not the letters of a woman conducting an affair exactly, though there was feeling in them that should not have been there. They were the letters of a woman who was frightened, who had found in Rex Dunmore the appearance of a refuge from a life she described in terms of isolation, cold, and a husband who was present in body but absent in every way that matters. But threaded through the fear and the loneliness was something else, something that only revealed itself fully in the 4th and final letter, written 2 weeks before Clara's disappearance. Rex had been promising her things: land, a house, a life elsewhere funded by what he said was a business opportunity he and Colt had built together, an opportunity that Rex said Colt refused to share, fairly hoarding profits that were rightfully both theirs. He says, "You will never let me leave with anything," Clara had written. He says the only way is to go quickly and quietly and trust that he will have the money when we arrive. I'm afraid, I am so afraid, but I am more afraid of staying. Lian set the letters down. She sat very still in the cold kitchen, listening to the wind and the fire, and tried to understand what she was holding. Clara had not been taken. She had left willingly, or as willingly as someone fleeing could be said to be willing. She had gone to Rex Dunmore, and Rex Dunmore had told her that Colt was keeping her from her fair share of a business they'd built together. Lian thought about what Ned Cartwright had said in the Store People Talk and understood now what kind of talking it was. The town believed Colt had made his wife disappear, and the man who had made Clara believe her husband was a thief was the same man the town's gossip had conveniently obscured. She retied the bundle carefully with the kitchen twine. She placed it at the back of the highest shelf behind the old tin of time, in a different hiding place than she had found it. And she made the calculation that had always been her strongest survival skill. Not yet. Wait, watch. There is more to learn before anything should be done with this. Rex Dunmore arrived at Stone Ridge Ranch on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after the blizzard ended, riding ahead of a minor storm that was more bluster than substance. He came with 4 men, all of them on good horses, all of them wearing the particular careful blankness of men who were paid to look dangerous without being asked to prove it yet. Lian was at the kitchen window when the riders appeared on the drive. She saw Colt come out of the barn and stop, and even from across the yard she could see the way his body changed, not tensed exactly because tensed implied the possibility of relaxation. He went still in the way of something that had been still all along and was simply revealing it. "Stay inside," one of the older ranch hands said behind her without explaining why, and she understood that the man on the lead horse was someone who required no explanation. She stayed at the window instead. Rex Dunmore was handsome in the way of someone who had cultivated his appearance as a professional tool. Expensive coat, good hat, the kind of horseman who rode like the animal was an extension of himself. He dismounted with practiced ease and smiled at Colt across the yard with a warmth that was so entirely constructed she could see the architecture of it from 40 feet away. "Colt Harlan," he called. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough." Colt's voice crossing the yard was completely level. "What do you want, Dunmore?" "Is that any way to greet an old friend?" Rex spread his hands in expansive gesture, all openness and reason. "I've ridden a long way. Storm coming. I'm just asking for frontier hospitality. A night in your barn. Nothing more." The silence stretched. Lian watched Colt's hands, both visible, both still, neither near the gun she had only recently noticed he wore. She could see him running the calculation the frontier code was not optional. Refusing shelter before a storm to anyone was the kind of action that left marks on a man's reputation that weather and time never fully erased. "The barn," Colt said finally. "One night, you leave at first light." Rex smiled. It did not touch anything above his cheekbones. Generous as always. He turned and his eyes found the kitchen window and found Lian behind it. The way his gaze traveled over her, assessing, dismissive, interested in the way something might be interested in a tool, made her step back from the glass. Not out of fear, out of the cold recognition that she was looking at a man who did not see people. He saw inventory. She heard him say something to Colt. She couldn't make out the words from behind the glass, but she heard the shift in tone, the deliberate provocation of it. She heard Colt's response. It was not words exactly. It was the sound of someone who has been pushed to a precise limit and who has made, in that moment, the decision to push back. The other ranch hands moved. Rex's men moved. For 30 seconds, the yard was a calculation in which the wrong variable would mean violence. Then Rex laughed, that sound like breaking glass, light and sharp and carrying nothing, and led his men toward the barn. When Colt came inside, Lian was at the stove, adding wood with deliberate calm. "I heard," she said before he could speak. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He was trying to provoke you. He succeeded only with himself." She turned. "How do you know him?" The answer took a moment. He moved to the table and sat down, and she saw that he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's work. "We came west around the same time. Both had nothing, both were trying to build something from it." He ran a hand over Sisfisuan. "For a while we were building it together." "What happened?" He was quiet for a long moment. "The partnership ended badly," he said finally. "I found out he'd been doing things I couldn't have been part of and stayed whole, lying to investors, paying surveyors to falsify reports on mineral rights. He had a talent for making other people's money serve him, and he was good enough at it that people didn't notice until they were already ruined." His voice was flat with old disgust. "I dissolved the partnership. He blamed me for the collapse of everything that followed. And your wife." The silence this time was different in quality. Longer, heavier. She had not meant to ask. The question had arrived at the end of her sentence without permission, pulled by the letters on the shelf above her head and the weight of what she was carrying. Colt looked at her with eyes that went very dark and very still, and she thought for a moment that she had broken something. Then he said quietly, "Where did you hear about Clara?" "Ned Cartwright. In the store." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry, I didn't ask him. He told me without being asked, and I have been carrying it since then and not knowing what to do with it." The muscles in his jaw moved. He looked away out the kitchen window at the barn where Rex Dunmore was being settled for the night by men who worked for him. "She left," he said, 3 years ago, November. She was gone when I woke up one morning and she never came back." His voice was stripped down to something close to bone. "I looked for her. I hired men to look for her. The sheriff looked. She was simply gone." He paused. "People decided it was easier to believe I had done something to her than to believe a woman had left a prosperous ranch by choice. And had she left by choice?" The question sat in the air between them. His eyes came back to her, careful, reading her face with the same attention she had seen him give to weather and to cattle, and to the particular calculation of whether someone was worth trusting. "Yes," he said, "I believe she did. I believe she was unhappy for a long time and I was too focused on building this place to see it. I believe she went somewhere she thought she'd be happier. His voice was very quiet now. I never blamed her for leaving. I blamed myself for giving her reasons to. Lian stood at the stove and held this and thought about the letters on the shelf above the old tin of time. Colt, she said carefully, I think Rex Dunmore may have had something to do with where she went. He looked at her. I found something when I was repairing the stove. She moved to the shelf, reached to the back and took down the bundle. She set it on the table in front of him and stepped back. He looked at the letters for a long moment. His hands were very still. Then he reached out and picked up the bundle, untied the twine and read. She gave him the privacy of not watching. She turned to the stove and made tea she didn't need and pretended to be busy with the cups, while the kitchen held the particular pressurized silence of a man reading something that was rearranging the floor beneath him. When she turned back, he had set the letters down. His face was composed with an effort she could see. She told him I was keeping money from her, he said, that the partnership profits were partly hers. Yes, there was no money I kept from her. The partnership was failing when I dissolved it. There was nothing to divide. His voice was absolutely controlled. He told her there was. He used her loneliness, her unhappiness with me as a way to get her out of the ranch. She was leverage, or bait. He paused. She trusted him because she had no one else to trust. Lian waited. She died, he said, a year after she left. Fever in a town on the Kansas border. The sheriff there sent word eventually. He set the letters down on the table with the careful precision of someone putting down something that should not be dropped. I never told anyone. It seemed there was no reason to tell people. She was gone either way. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the eaves with a sound like something searching for a way in. He's here to make sure you can't prove any of this, Lian said. Yes. He looked up at her, and he saw you tonight. She understood what that meant. Rex Dunmore had seen inventory. He had seen something Colt valued, and a man who had already used one woman as leverage would not fail to notice the potential for using another. Then we should be careful, she said. Both of us. Lian. We should be careful, she repeated more firmly. Not frightened. There is a difference. Careful means we know the danger and we prepare for it. Frightened means we give him what he wants before he's even asked for it. She moved the tea to the table, set cups down, and sat across from him. Tell me what he wants. Not what he said tonight, what he actually wants. And Colt told her there in the warm kitchen with the snow beginning against the windows and Rex Dunmore settled in the barn 40 yards away, the full shape of a 15-year conflict that had been waiting since the moment Lian arrived to finally come to a head. Rex and his men left at first light as Colt had demanded. Lian watched from the kitchen window as they rode out into the cold morning, unhurried Rex with his back to the house, not looking behind him, which was, she thought, its own kind of threat. Men who looked back over their shoulder were worried. Men who didn't were planning. The ranch hands spent the morning in the relieved, loose-limbed mood of people who had braced for trouble and been spared it. Cody and Finn helped Lian carry firewood, a task neither of them had been assigned, and she let them because they needed to be useful, and she had learned to recognize that need. Miss Zhao, Cody said, stacking wood by the kitchen door with more care than the job strictly required. Who was that man? An old acquaintance of Mr. Harlan's. Didn't seem like a friendly acquaintance. No, she agreed. He didn't. The boss looked different when he was here. Colder. Cody frowned at the wood in his hands. Like something he keeps put away was getting out. She looked at the young man beside her, who was almost as perceptive as he was earnest, and thought they all see it. Everyone who lives alongside Colt Harlan knows there is something locked in him. They just don't know the key. Mr. Harlan carries things the way most of us do, she said carefully. Privately, because there's no other way. Cody nodded the way young men nod when they're hearing something they'll only fully understand later. The weeks after Rex's visit brought a quality of watchfulness to the ranch that Lian felt in the air, the way you felt the pressure of an incoming storm, not visible yet, but present in the quality of the silence. Colt said little about Rex in the letters, but she noticed that he had added a second man to the night watch rotation without announcement, and that the locked chest in the study that she had assumed held financial records now held the letters as well with a new padlock. She taught Finn and Cody to make dumplings. This had become somehow a ritual. Thursday evenings, when the early darkness arrived and the ranch hands had finished their after-dinner card games and drifted to their bunks, and the kitchen was hers, and the boys, and occasionally Colt's if he appeared in the doorway with coffee and settled into his habitual watching posture. "Fold it like this," she said, demonstrating on the wrapper in her palm. "The pleat goes 3 times from right to left, like this." Finn's version was admirable. Cody's looked like something that had fallen from a height. "I'm terrible at this," Cody said with the cheerful despair of someone who had accepted his limitations. "You're learning," Lian said. "Terrible is where learning starts." Colt in the doorway. "He's not wrong about being terrible." "Mr. Harlan," Cody said with dignity, "with all due respect, I'd like to see your dumplings." "You wouldn't," but the corner of his mouth was doing the thing. "The boss has many skills," Finn said solemnly to Cody. "Cooking is not among them. I have seen what he made during the 6 weeks before Miss Zhao arrived, and it was an atrocity. It kept everyone alive." "Barely, sir, barely." Lian carefully kept her expression neutral, though it cost her. These evenings, the warmth of the kitchen, the boys' laughter, Colt's dry observations from the doorway had become something she did not have a word for in either English or Cantonese. In Guangdong, her grandmother had called it jiachi home breath, the particular warmth of a space that had been exhaled into by people who belonged to each other. She had not expected to find it here. She had not allowed herself to look for it. It had arrived anyway in the way that the best things always did, not announced, not invited, but inevitable, once it came. In late February, a woman appeared in Ridgecross who had not been there before. Lian encountered her at Ned Cartwright's store on a supply run a Saturday, clear and cold Colt, at the land office while Lian ordered kitchen goods. The woman was standing at the dry goods counter when Lian came in, and she turned with the particular alertness of someone who had been expecting this encounter. She was perhaps 35, well-dressed in a way that spoke of somewhere larger than Wyoming, with dark hair and a face that was familiar in a way Lian could not immediately place. "Miss Zhao," the woman said. Her voice was careful. "I was hoping to meet you." Lian set her supply list on the counter. "I'm sorry, I don't know you." "No, but I know who you are." She extended a gloved hand. "Vivian Ashford. I've come from Denver." The name meant nothing. Lian shook the offered hand and waited. Vivian Ashford looked at her with eyes that were doing a great deal of work, assessing, deciding, calculating the risk of whatever she was about to say. "My sister," she said finally, "was Clara Harlan." The cold in the store became a different kind of cold entirely. "I see," Lian said very carefully. "I've been trying to find out what happened to her for 3 years. The sheriff here told me what he believed, but—" Vivian's voice tightened slightly. "Clara wrote to me before she disappeared. She told me she was leaving Colt. She told me she was going with a man named Rex Dunmore." She paused. "She never wrote again after that. And then I received word that she had died." "I'm sorry," Lian said. She meant it. "Miss Zhao." Vivian's voice was low, her eyes direct. "I am not here to make trouble for anyone. I am here because my sister is dead, and I believe Rex Dunmore had a great deal to do with the circumstances of her death. I believe he manipulated her. I believe he used her." She glanced toward the window toward the land office down the street. "And I do not know whether Colt Harlan was complicit in any of it, or whether he is as much a victim as Clara was." She looked back at Lian. "You live on that ranch. You know him. Tell me what you believe." Lian stood very still in the cold store and thought about the letters in the locked chest and the man who had watched over a sick boy all night without being asked, and the man who had stepped between her and Rex Dunmore's deliberate contempt. "I believe," she said carefully, "that Colt Harlan is a man who made mistakes and that his largest mistake was being too focused on building something to see what he was losing." She met Vivian's eyes. "I do not believe he harmed your sister. I believe he loved her imperfectly, and she left him, and he has been carrying the weight of that every day since." She paused. "I believe Rex Dunmore told her lies designed to make her go, and I believe he did it because she was useful to him as leverage against Colt. And then she died and he moved on, and he is still coming for what he wants." Vivian Ashford looked at her for a long moment. "You care about him." Lian did not answer immediately. "I trust him," she said finally. "That is the truest thing I can tell you right now." The bell above the store door opened. They both turned. Colt stood in the doorway, his eyes moving from Lian to the woman beside her, and she watched the recognition arrive on his face, slow, then fast, then very controlled. Vivian, he said. Colt. She said his name without warmth, but also without hostility. Just the particular register of someone who has been carrying grief alongside suspicion for a long time and has not yet been given reason to put either down. The silence between them was 3 years wide. We should talk, Vivian said. Yes, Colt said. We should. The conversation happened at the ranch that evening, in the main room with Lion present, because Colt had asked her to stay, and because Vivian had directed the most important part of her questions at Lion anyway. It was not an easy conversation. Vivian loved her sister and had spent 3 years in the particular agony of not knowing the truth, and she had arrived in Wyoming prepared for Colt Harlan to be either a monster or a coward. He was neither, and the conversation required her to dismantle and rebuild her understanding of what had happened to Clara in real time, which was painful to watch. Colt told her everything: the marriage's slow deterioration, the weight of his own absorption in the ranch's expansion, the morning Clara was gone, the search, the eventual word of her death. He told it without self-defense and without minimizing his failures. He simply told the truth in the plain, unvarnished way he did everything. He did not tell Vivian about the letters. He looked at Lian once briefly, and she understood not yet. She was unhappy, Vivian said finally. Her voice was tired. She wrote to me about the loneliness. I told her to give it more time. I told her ranch life was hard for everyone at first. She pressed her hands together in her lap. I should have told her to come home. She wouldn't have come, Colt said gently. Clara had her own kind of stubbornness. She needed to believe she was making the right choice until she'd made it. Vivian looked at him, really looked for the first time without the lens of suspicion. Did you love her, Chipamua? I did, imperfectly and late in learning what she needed, but yes. A long silence. Rex Dunmore wrote to me, Vivian said, after she died. A condolence letter. Her voice went cold. He wrote that she had been happy, that they had been planning a life together, that it was a tragedy. She looked at her hands. I believed him because I had no reason not to. He lied, Colt said, about a great deal. I know that now. She looked at Lian. Miss Zhao told me enough to know. She stood gathering herself. I don't know what I came here expecting to find. I don't know what I'm going home with instead. She paused. But I don't believe you hurt her, Colt. I think you were both in something you didn't know how to get out of, and someone else decided to use that. She left the next morning back to Denver, but she left Colt a Denver address and a promise if he needed witnesses who could speak to Clara's state of mind before she left, and to Rex Dunmore's communications with her, she would come back. After Vivian was gone, the ranch settled into the particular stillness of a place where the air has been cleared by honesty, and something new is beginning to breathe in the space it left. Colt found Lian in the kitchen the following evening preparing bread dough and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. She waited, knowing the silence was preliminary. I'm sorry, he said, for not telling you about Clara myself. You should have heard it from me, not from a shopkeeper. It was yours to tell when you were ready. She worked the dough with steady hands. I didn't need to know it to trust you. Most people would have. I'm not most people. She glanced up. You should know that by now. He came into the kitchen properly, crossing the threshold instead of occupying the doorway, and sat down at the table in the way he did when he meant to stay. She noticed he had been doing this more often lately, coming in rather than standing at the edge. Your contract ends in April, he said. She knew this. She had been thinking about it in the careful, sideways way of someone approaching something that mattered too much to approach directly. I'd like to offer you a permanent position, he said. Year-round, better wages, your own cottage if you want more privacy than the room off the kitchen. He paused. I'm asking you to stay, Lian. Not just as a cook, as someone who belongs here. The words settled over her like the first warmth of a fire in a cold room. I need to think about it, she said honestly. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going to row, she said, if that's what you were worried about. His mouth moved into the almost smile. That's not what I'm worried about. Outside, the sun had gone below the mountains, and the sky was doing the thing it did in Wyoming, turning colors that seemed excessive. that seemed to be making a point. Through the kitchen window, the light fell across the table between them, gold and warm, and she thought, I came here to survive the winter. I came here to earn wages and keep moving. I did not come here to find this. Ask me again in a week, she said. I'll have an answer. He nodded once and stayed, and they spent the rest of the evening in the easy, inhabited silence of two people who have stopped pretending they are not becoming something to each other. Spring refused to arrive cleanly. March came in with warm days that melted the top inch of snow and cold nights that froze it to a crust, transforming the ranch grounds into a treacherous landscape of ice disguised as compacted earth. The cattle were restless, sensing the change, but unable to act on it yet. The ranch hands were restless too, ready for the physical relief of longer days and outdoor work after months of close quarters. Lian channeled her own restlessness into the kitchen garden she had been planning since January. She had asked Colt for a section of ground near the south face of the main house, sheltered with good sun exposure, and he had said yes without asking what she needed it for. She spent her free hours sketching layouts, calculating what she could grow that would survive Wyoming's short season, what herbs she could keep that her grandmother had taught her to use. It was a future act she understood. A person who plants a garden is saying, I will be here to tend it. I will be here to harvest it. She had not yet given Colt her answer. You're going to stay, Finn said one morning, with the serene confidence of a 20-year-old who has decided he understands things. He was helping her move supply crates from the cold room, a task that had become one of his self-appointed contributions. The garden tells you that. Nobody plans a garden if they're leaving. Perhaps I'm planning it for whoever comes after me. He gave her the look of a young man who has heard an implausible thing said with a straight face. Miss Zhao, with respect. No. She allowed herself the small smile she had been suppressing. Mind your business, Finn. Yes, ma'am. That crate goes by the window. Yes. He moved the crate, cheerfully unoffended. And she watched him and thought about how strange it was that she had arrived in this country believing she would spend her life in movement, from job to job, city to city, always provisional, always temporary, because that was the life available to women who looked like her and had nothing behind them. She had built an entire identity around the economics of impermanence. She had made herself good at leaving before she could be asked to, and now here she was, planning a garden. She gave Colt her answer on a Wednesday evening in the third week of March, standing on the front porch in the cold with the mountains going purple in the distance and the first stars appearing in the east. Yes, she said, I'll stay. He turned from the railing to look at her, and she saw in his face the particular relief of a man who has been careful not to hope too much. Good, he said, then after a moment, thank you. Don't thank me, it's a selfish decision. She looked out at the mountains. I am staying because this is the first place in 2 years that has felt like it might become mine. Because the men here have become something like family. Because she stopped and started again more carefully. Because there is someone here worth staying for, and I am done running from things that are worth staying for. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the roughness she had learned to recognize as sincerity stripped of any protective layer. I've been afraid, he said. Since Clara left, since I understood why she left, I've been afraid of asking too much from people. Afraid of being the thing that kept someone from happiness and they deserve to find somewhere else. And now I'm more afraid of not asking. He looked at her directly. I'm asking Lian, not just for the permanent position, for you to know that I want whatever comes after the permanent position, that I'm asking for that too, even if it's too soon to say it plainly. She turned to face him fully. He was watching her with those dark, careful eyes, and she thought this man who says things only when he means them completely, who has been building his honesty the way he built this ranch slowly out of hard material, meant to last. It's not too soon, she said. I know what you're asking. And I am also asking for the same thing, whatever it is after the job. He reached out and took her hand, not tentatively, not with the measured caution of the past months, but simply and directly the way a man takes the hand of someone he has decided belongs with him. His fingers were warm and rough and completely certain. They stood on the porch together in the cold spring evening, holding hands while the last light left the mountains, and said nothing else because nothing else needed to be said. The change was not dramatic. It was small and daily, an adjustment in the quality of how they occupied the same space, the way you adjust to a new weight in a familiar coat. He came into the kitchen instead of hovering at the door. She stopped bracing herself every time he appeared. The morning coffee became something both of them moved toward, rather than a coincidence they were careful not to acknowledge. Finn and Cody, who had apparently been taking bets on the timeline of this development since sometime in January, collected from the older hands with the quiet satisfaction of young men who were right about something they had no business being right about. "We're happy for you," Cody told her directly one morning with the straightforward sincerity of someone who had not yet learned to be awkward about sincerity. "Both of you, this is a better place with you in it, and the boss is a better man when you're around. That's just true." "Cody," she handed him a bowl of eggs to crack. "Thank you, now focus." "Yes, ma'am." She taught him to make congee that morning, rice cooked down to a silky, forgiving porridge, seasoned with ginger and green onion, the kind of food her mother had made for them when someone was sick or sad or simply needed something uncomplicated and warm. He made it badly the first time, and acceptably the second, and with surprising competence the third. "My grandmother would be astonished," Lian said, which was not entirely untrue. "Oh, hi, Tuo." "A cowboy making congee." "Don't tell the others," Cody said. "They'll never let me hear the end of it." She kept his secret. It felt like part of the same thing, the accumulation of small trust, the way a home was built not from one large act, but from 1,000 small ones, each saying, "I see you. I keep your small things carefully. You are safe with me." The letter from Rex Dunmore arrived in early April. It was addressed to Colt Formal Legal, in tone the handwriting of a man who had learned to use paper as a weapon because it left marks harder to argue with than words. Lian was not present when Colt read it, but she saw his face when he came into the kitchen afterward, and the letter was in his hand like something he'd rather have burned. "He's filed a legal claim," Colt said, setting the letter on the kitchen table with the deliberate placement of someone controlling their hands, "on the Northridge mineral rights. He says he has documentation that I signed them over to him as part of the original partnership dissolution." He looked at her. "I never signed anything like that. There was no such agreement." "He forged it." "Almost certainly." His voice was very quiet. "He has lawyers in Denver. Good ones. And he has a document with what looks like my signature." He paused. "If this goes before a territorial judge without a counter-argument, he takes the Northridge." Lian sat down at the table. She looked at the letter without touching it, reading what she could from the formal, careful language of it. "There's more," Colt said. "At the end, the last paragraph." She read it. Rex Dunmore, in the polished language of a man delivering a threat by way of legal correspondence, expressed his hope that the matter could be resolved amicably, and his further hope that all parties, including the recently appointed domestic staff, would remain undisturbed throughout the proceedings. A threat so wrapped in courtesy it was nearly invisible. Nearly. "He's telling you that I'm a card he can play," Lian said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about this with the focused clarity that had always been her best emergency resource. "When is the court date?" "6 weeks." "Then we have 6 weeks to find the counter-argument." She looked up at him. "The letters from Clara. They established that Rex had access to your business records, that he knew enough about the partnership to fabricate documents. They show motive and method." She paused. "And Vivian, she received communications from Rex directly. She can speak to his pattern." "It's not enough," Oji, Colt said. "A judge will want the original documents. He'll want to see the signatures compared. He'll want evidence, not letters between a dead woman and a man who's good at covering his tracks." He sat down across from her, heavy with it. "Rex has been doing this for 15 years. He's had practice." "Then we need the original documents," she said. "His forgeries, or his records. Something he doesn't know we have." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and she thought, this is the real fight. The other night, Rex in the yard, the guns, the bravado, that was just the opening move. This is where it actually happens. "He'll come back before the court date," she said. "Yes. And he'll try to resolve it his way before it can be resolved legally." "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. "Then we prepare for both. We fight the legal wet, and we prepare for what he does when the legal battle isn't moving fast enough." She met his eyes. But Colt, we need to tell the sheriff about the letters. We need to make sure someone outside this ranch knows what we know so that if something happens, nothing is going to happen to you. I didn't say to me, I said if something happens to either of us, the letters need to be in safekeeping beyond this ranch. She held his gaze steadily. I am not being frightened. I'm being careful. There is a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, you're right. I know. The ghost of a smile moved across his face, gone before it fully arrived. I'm going to spend the next 40 years being managed by you, aren't I? Come only when you need it, she said, which is less often than you think and more often than you'd like. He laughed briefly, genuinely, the rare sound of a man who doesn't laugh easily and means it completely when he does. They went to Sheriff Briggs the following morning. The sheriff was a compact, methodical man in his 60s who had been keeping order in Ridgecross long enough to have seen most varieties of human behavior and had learned to take new information seriously rather than comfortably. He read the letters without comment, looked at the legal notice from Dunmore's attorneys, and asked 3 careful questions. You believe these letters establish a prior relationship between Dunmore and your wife that preceded her disappearance? Yes, Colt said. You believe he used that relationship to facilitate her departure in a way that served his interests? Yes. And you believe the document he's filed with the territorial court a record is a forgery? I know it is. I never signed anything like it. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he took the letters and placed them in his safe and gave Colt a receipt for them. I'll write to the marshal's office in Cheyenne, he said. Document forgery is a federal matter if it involves land rights. That takes it out of the territorial court's hands and into someone who can apply real pressure. He looked at Colt over his desk. In the meantime, you should know that Dunmore has been in town. He's been here for 3 days at the hotel. He's been asking questions. What kind of questions? About Miss Zhao, the sheriff said, and looked at Lian directly. About how long she's been at the ranch. Whether she has family. Whether anyone would miss her if she left suddenly. He paused. I told him I didn't know the answers to those questions, which was a lie. I know the answers. I just didn't feel like sharing them with him. Lian met the sheriff's eyes. Thank you. Miss Zhao. He said it with the plain directness of an older man saying what he meant. You've done good by this town, and by those boys at Stone Ridge. Dunmore won't find much hospitality here if he tries to use you as leverage. He looked at Colt. But I'd keep her close. Colt said nothing. But his hand, when they walked back to the wagon, found hers and held it all the way to the end of the street. That evening, Colt told her the rest of what he had held back. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the house quiet around them. The ranch hands settled in the bunkhouse. The fire had burned down to coals, and neither of them had risen to add wood, as though they both knew that what needed to be said required a certain dimness to say. Clara and I, he said, should never have married. I understood that about a year in. I think she understood it earlier. He looked at his hands. She was a good woman who wanted things I didn't know how to provide, not material things, but warmth, presence. She needed someone who could sit still with her. I was always moving, always building, always 3 steps ahead of where I was. He paused. She tried to tell me. I heard the words and didn't hear what they meant. That's on me. You were young, Lian said. I was 40. That's not young. You were young in ways that don't have anything to do with age. You were young in knowing what you needed from another person. She looked at him. Everyone is young in that way until they learn it. Some people never learn it at all. He looked at her for a long moment. I've been afraid, he said, that I'll do the same thing again. That I'll get absorbed in the ranch and the work in building things and not see what's standing right in front of me. He paused. That I'll make the same mistake with you. Then don't, she said simply. He blinked. She thought she saw him trying to find the more complicated version of her answer, the catch in it. That's all. That is all. You know what you did wrong. You know what it got. You are not the same man you were. Neither of us is who we were before the things that broke us. She folded her hands on the table. The question is not whether you are capable of the mistake. The question is whether you will choose to see me clearly, whether you will look. She held his gaze. I believe you will. That is why I said yes. The fire in the coals was very low. Outside, the night was clear and cold and enormous, the Wyoming sky thick with stars. "I'm going to build us a house," he said quietly, "when the spring work allows. Not the cottage I offered, a proper house. On the rise above the valley where the view goes to the mountains. Ours from the beginning." She felt the weight of this, the fullness of it, the terrifying, beautiful fullness of someone offering you a future and meaning, every word of it. "I would like that very much," she said. He reached across the table. She took his hand, and they sat together in the dimming kitchen while the coals went slowly dark and the stars outside the window did their slow, ancient work of burning. The kiss happened in the kitchen because of course it did. Where else would everything true between them have happened? She was making dumplings, which had become their shared ritual. And he came in at an hour when the ranch hands were occupied elsewhere, and he stood watching her for a moment with the expression she had learned meant he was about to say something he had been building toward for days. "Lian," he said. "I know," she said, because she did. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she turned, and he cupped her face in his hands with the same and an absolute care he brought to everything that mattered to him, and kissed her with a gentleness that was also somehow completely certain. She kissed him back and felt something unlock in her chest that she had not known was locked, or had known and had decided she could live without. Turned out she had been wrong about that. Turned out some locks are meant to open. When they finally stepped back, both of them were breathing differently. "I've wanted to do that since January," he said. "I know," she said again. "Is it going to be inconvenient as a practical matter?" She thought about this seriously because he deserved a serious answer. "Enormously," she said, "and completely unavoidable. So I suppose we should stop pretending otherwise." "I love you," he said. The words came out simply, without construction, just the fact of them plain as stone. She felt them land in the center of her chest and stay there. "I love you also," she said, "even though it is frightening and complicated, and I was not planning on it." He laughed that rare, real laugh and pulled her back into his arm, and she stood in the warm kitchen with her arms around a man who had stopped being her employer some weeks ago and had become instead something much harder to name and much better to have. They broke ground for the house on the first Monday of April on the gentle rise above the valley where Lian had chosen the site, and within a week the project had become the defining fact of life at Stone Ridge Ranch. Every available hand contributed, not because Colt had asked, though he had, but because they had all been waiting for a reason to celebrate something, and this was finally it. Jackson, the oldest ranch hand at 53, had spent 3 years before the frontier building houses in Ohio and new timber joinery. 2 of the younger men had fathers who were stonemasons and had absorbed more knowledge than they realized. Everyone else contributed muscle and enthusiasm and a degree of vested interest that occasionally required Colt to gently redirect. "The kitchen window faces east," Lian said firmly for the 3rd time. "East gets the morning light, but the west wall." "I know what the west wall does. The kitchen window faces east." Usual Colt, who had made the mistake of suggesting a different orientation, held up both hands in the universal gesture of tactical retreat. "East," he agreed. Finn, who was nearby holding a measuring rope, wisely looked at the ground. The house rose through April with a speed that felt like collective will made visible. Stone for the foundation, timber for the frame, the shape of rooms emerging slowly from the Wyoming earth. Lian spent her off hours designing the interior with Colt, what they needed, what they wanted, the language of a shared life built into the architecture of a shared space. "A room for memory," she said one evening over the plans spread across the kitchen table. "A place to keep things from before. Your family, mine, a place where what was lost can be honored without being buried." He looked at her with the expression she had come to love most, the one that meant he was surprised and then understood, and then was grateful in a way he would never quite find the words for. "The room at the back of the house," he said. "Best light." "Yes." Rex Dunmore came back on a Thursday. Not alone this time, he arrived with 8 men, the hired gun blankness of 4 of them, identical to the men he'd brought before the other 4 new faces who had the look of men recently acquired for a specific purpose. They came in the early afternoon when the ranch hands were in the south pasture and the house was quiet. Lian was in the kitchen when she heard horses. She went to the window. Rex was already dismounting or already scanning the buildings with the proprietary assessment of a man deciding what he's going to take. He saw her in the window. He smiled. She was already moving to the back of the house to the chest in Colt's study where the second rifle was kept. She knew the combination. She knew it because Colt had told her to learn it months ago with the same methodical foresight he brought to everything. She heard his voice in the yard before she reached the study, Colt coming in from the barn, the measured cadence of a man who has seen a threat arriving and is deciding the exact right response to it. Dunmore. Harlan, Rex's voice carrying through the walls with the ease of a man who liked the sound of himself. We should talk. We had our lawyer talk. Anything else needs to be said in front of a judge. I was thinking somewhere more private than a courtroom. A pause that had weight in it. I was thinking you come with me, we settle this between ourselves the way it should have been settled years ago. Old-fashioned. Another pause. Or things get more complicated. Lian had the rifle. She was at the side window now, looking out at an angle that showed her Rex's men spreading out across the yard in the so practiced way of people being positioned. They were cutting off exits. They were creating a situation. She saw the moment one of them noticed her at the window. She did not move. She looked back at him with the steady, unafraid attention of a woman who had been deciding what she was capable of since long before this morning, and she held the rifle in plain sight, and she did not blink. The man looked away. Rex was still talking. She could hear the cadence of it through the glass, the deliberate, reasonable tone of a man making an unreasonable demand sound like an obvious compromise. And beneath it, the thing he hadn't said yet, but was clearly moving toward. She heard him say her name. She heard Colt's response. Then she heard the door open and she was already moving. She came through the front door with the rifle at a carry position, not raised, not aggressive, just present, just visible. She walked to stand beside Colt and looked at Rex Dunmore with the composed expression of someone who has decided exactly where the line is and is standing on her side of it. Rex looked at her with the particular affront of a man who expected fear and received none. Miss Zhao, he said, this is between. I know what this is between, she said. I am part of this ranch. What concerns Mr. Harlan concerns me. She met his eyes. And I have been listening for some minutes now, and what I have heard is a man making a legal threat that has already been forwarded to the federal marshal's office combined with a personal threat that the sheriff in Ridgecross is also already aware of. She paused. Your leverage depends on people being afraid of you and uninformed about their options. We are neither. Rex stared at her. Also, she added, there are 8 of you and 11 of us. The ranch hands are 20 minutes away, and they were already riding in when I saw you arrive. I sent Cody on the shortcut. She did not know if this was true. It didn't matter. So whatever calculation you came here to run, I'd suggest running it again. Silence. Rex Dunmore looked from Lian to Colt to the empty road and to his own men, and she watched him do the mathematics not of the immediate moment which he could possibly still control, but of the larger situation which he had just realized was not what he had believed it to be. This isn't over, he said. No, Colt agreed, but it's over for today. Take your men and go. Rex looked at Lian one more time with eyes that had put aside the pretense of civility. She looked back at him steadily and thought, you have spent 15 years hurting people who were afraid of you. You have not yet met someone who learned to stop being afraid of things like you. He left. Not quickly, not with any obvious loss of composure. Rex Dunmore was too practiced for that, but he left. And when the last of his men's horses had disappeared around the bend, the ranch yard was very quiet, and then Colt put his hands on her shoulders from behind and pressed his forehead to the back of her head and breathed, just breathed, for a long moment. You don't know if Cody actually went for the others, he said. No, she agreed, but he didn't know that. You're terrifying, he said. That's the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Good, she said. I worked hard at it. He laughed and she felt the tension leave his chest against her back, and they stood in the empty yard in the spring afternoon sunlight and were for a moment completely and profoundly all right. The all right lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th day, Lian rode to town alone on one of the ranch's smaller horses to pick up a specific order of supplies that had arrived on the Tuesday stage. She had done this before. It was an ordinary task. Colt had work at the north pasture that couldn't be moved and had said he'd send a hand with her, and she had said it was unnecessary, and they had disagreed about this in the mild, comfortable way of 2 people who had started to know each other's habits and found them generally charming and occasionally maddening. She made it to Ridgecross without incident and collected her supplies and was putting them into the saddlebags in front of Ned Cartwright's store when a man she didn't know approached her from her left. She understood what was happening before he reached her. The angle of the approach, the deliberate casualness of it, the second man she clocked moving on her right from the corner of her vision. She didn't run. Running was for people who had not thought through what to do before it was necessary. She turned and looked at the first man directly. "If you put a hand on me she said clearly, "it will be in full view of the telegraph office, in a general store in a town where the sheriff is personally aware of Rex Dunmore's activities and currently in contact with the federal marshal's office." The man blinked. "Is that what your employer is paying you to have happen?" she asked. A pause. Then the second man from behind her. "Come quietly. He just wants to talk. Nobody gets hurt." She turned slowly to include both of them. "And if I don't, the boss has a way of making things difficult for people who—" "I know what the boss does," she said calmly. "I also know that the federal marshal in Cheyenne has been contacted, that the sheriff here has the documentation, and that if I disappear, there will be consequences for everyone involved that your boss cannot contain." She met the second man's eyes. "So the question is, are you being paid enough for those consequences? Because Rex Dunmore is losing this fight. The people he hires are going to lose with him. Is that the side you want to be on?" Another pause. She saw the calculation happen. The shorter math doing the job, getting paid. The longer math what came after, what it cost, whether the money was enough for what was being asked. The first man stepped back. The second man looked at his partner, then at her, then away. "Tell the boss you weren't here," he said to the first man. "Tell him she wasn't in town." They left. Lian stood outside Ned Cartwright's store and let the adrenaline move through her body, and then she went inside and asked Ned to send an urgent telegraph to Stone Ridge Ranch. When Colt arrived 40 minutes later, riding too fast, she was sitting in Ned's back office with a cup of tea and a very complete account of what had happened written out for the sheriff. "You're all right," he said, coming through the door, his eyes doing a fast inventory. "I'm all right," she confirmed. He pulled her into his arms with the controlled force of a man who has been very frightened and is now very relieved. She let herself be held for a moment and then stepped back. "He tried to use me as leverage," she said. "He failed, but he'll try again, and next time, he'll be less subtle about it." She looked at him steadily. "We need to end this before the court date." "I know. We need to find his forgery, the original document or the evidence of how he produced it. Without that, the legal case is his word against yours." "I know." His jaw was tight. "I just don't know where it is." She thought about the man she had looked at across a Wyoming yard 3 days ago. The way his eyes had moved over the ranch buildings, not angry, not desperate, but calculating. The proprietary assessment of someone doing inventory. "He keeps records," she said. "He's been in business too long not to. A man who forges documents keeps proof that the forgeries worked in case he needs leverage over the people who helped him." She looked at Colt. "He has an office in town, at the hotel. He's been staying there." "I can't break into his hotel room, Lian." "No," she agreed, "but I can ask the hotel owner what's already been found." She paused. "Ned told me when I was waiting the hotel owner's wife is Charlotte Briggs, the sheriff's sister." Colt looked at her. "Family talks to family," she said, "and Charlotte Briggs has been watching Rex Dunmore make himself at home in her husband's hotel for 3 weeks, asking uncomfortable questions about her brother's investigation." She met his eyes. "I think she would be very interested to know what kind of documents her guest has been leaving around." Charlotte Briggs was 60 spare with her brother's methodical intelligence and rather more willingness to use it. She had, it turned out, already been making note of Rex Dunmore's habits, what he asked for, who visited him, what he carried. She had the specific practical ethics of a woman who had run a frontier establishment for 30 years and understood the difference between her guests' privacy and her own safety. "He's had a lawyer visit twice," she told Lian in the hotel's back parlor, with the door closed. "Denver man, brings a leather satchel, leaves with it." She paused. "The second visit they had words. I heard the lawyer say something about I couldn't catch all of it, but I heard the signatures are traceable. And then Dunmore said, not if the originals are gone." Lian sat very still. The originals, she said carefully. You think he has them here? I think he had them here, Charlotte corrected. Past tense. After that conversation, he was in his room for 2 hours. Then he called for a fire to be laid, even though the weather didn't call for it. She looked at Lian with steady, intelligent eyes. I'm not saying I know what he burned. I'm saying I know he burned something. Lian exhaled. The original's gone. But Charlotte had said the lawyer mentioned the signatures were traceable, which meant the forgery itself had left evidence, the kind of evidence that existed in the document he had filed with the court, not in documents he could burn. Is there anyone in Ridgecross, Lian asked carefully, who has experience with handwriting analysis, document comparison? Charlotte Briggs smiled slowly, the smile of a woman who has been waiting to be asked the right question. My sister's husband, she said, taught penmanship at the Territorial Normal School for 20 years before he retired to Ridgecross. He can look at 2 samples and tell you if they came from the same hand in 10 minutes flat. She paused. He'd have to look at the filed document and at something Colt definitely signed. Lian stood up. Thank you, Mrs. Briggs, she said. Truly. Miss Zhao, Charlotte gave her the direct look of one capable woman to another. Dunmore has been trouble for people I care about for longer than he's been trouble for you. End him clean, and we'll call it even. The document comparison took 40 minutes. The penmanship teacher, a quiet, fastidious man named Howard Pace, who had the focused eyes of someone accustomed to finding the exact wrong detail, sat in the sheriff's office with the filed mineral rights document, 3 authenticated samples of Colt's genuine signature, and a magnifying lens, and said nothing for the entire 40 minutes except for small, precise sounds of assessment. When he was done, he set down the lens and folded his hands and said in the tone of a man delivering an examination result, these signatures were not produced by the same hand. The pressure points are wrong. The letter forms are close, very close, professionally done, but the habit of the authentic signatures shows a slight leftward pull at the terminus of the final letter that is entirely absent in the filed document. He paused. In my professional judgment, the document filed with the territorial court is a forgery. Sheriff Briggs wrote this down. He made 3 copies. He kept one, sent one by immediate telegraph to the marshal's office in Cheyenne, and handed the third to Colt with the expression of a man who had been doing his job for 30 years and was satisfied that it had finally produced the right result. I'll have him in custody by morning, Briggs said. Document forgery, attempted extortion, harassment, and depending on what Miss Zhao wants to sign 2 counts of attempted coercion. He looked at Lian. That's federal. He won't get out of it. Lian nodded. Colt's hand found hers in the sheriff's office, and she held it and thought it's over. Not the end of everything difficult, because there would always be more of that, but this particular battle fought over stolen land and a forged signature, and the long-delayed accounting of 15 years, this was done. Thank you, she said to the sheriff. Miss Zhao. He had the same warm gravity his sister did, apparently a family trait. You did most of the work. I just wrote it down. Rex Dunmore was arrested that evening at the Ridgecross Hotel, in his room by the sheriff and 2 deputies with a federal warrant in hand. Charlotte Briggs watched from the doorway of the parlor and said nothing, but her expression said everything. The ranch hands heard the news at dinner the next morning, and the celebration was not loud, not the spoon-banging joy of the first winter, but deep and settled the satisfaction of people who had been waiting for justice and had watched it actually arrive. Miss Zhao, Finn said, raising his coffee cup. I would like to say something. Finn, Miss Zhao, he said firmly with the dignity of a young man who had decided he was making a toast and would not be deterred. When you arrived here in November with 1 bag and the best cooking any of us had ever seen, none of us knew that we were also getting someone who would save Cody's life and my life, and probably all our lives more ways than one, and who would make the boss into someone who smiles at breakfast, which he did not do before, and who would, he paused, overcome by the ambition of his own sentence. What I'm trying to say is this ranch is better because of you, and why are better because of you, and we would all very much like you to stay. A chorus of agreement from down the table. Colt at the head looked at her with the expression she loved most. I'm already staying, she said. I've been staying for months. Someone planted a garden. Laughter. She let it wash over her and thought of her mother who had believed that feeding people was love made edible, and of her grandmother who had believed that healing was the highest use of knowledge, and of the jade piece in the bottom of her bag, and of the journey that had brought her from Guangdong to San Francisco, to Wyoming, to here, to this table, to these people, to this man across the room who was looking at her with his whole heart in his face and no more walls around it. You carried everything, she thought, and it brought you here. Spring arrived definitively in the third week of April, the way it always arrived in Wyoming, not gently, not gradually, but suddenly, and with conviction, as though the land had simply decided to stop tolerating winter and had moved on. The snow retreated to the shadows of the north-facing slopes and the higher ridges. The brown grass went green overnight. The meadow beyond the house filled with wildflowers, small hardy things, the kind that had survived 10,000 Wyoming winters by being indifferent to difficulty. The house was nearly finished. They had moved furniture in the previous weekend, a slow collaborative process that involved every ranch hand offering opinions nobody had asked for about the placement of large objects, and Lian overruling each opinion with the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly what she wants and is entirely uninterested in alternatives. Colt had watched this process from the doorway of the main room with an expression that suggested he was profoundly glad she was on his side. "The table faces the window," she said. "Absolutely," said every ranch hand who had been saying the table should face the other direction 30 seconds earlier. Finn, carrying one end of said table, looked at the ceiling. The room for memory was the last one they furnished. It was the best room in the house, true as Colt had promised, with light that came through its east and south windows in the morning and turned the pale walls gold. They brought in a low table, 2 chairs, the cedar box of her grandmother's remedies, and the silk square that had held her mother's knives, and 2 photographs Colt had found in storage. His parents on their Pennsylvania farm, serious-faced but solid, the kind of people who built things meant to last. Her father in the only photograph she had of him, standing in front of their house in Guangdong, with the particular dignity of a man who understands he is being preserved. They sat in the room for a long while without speaking, and it felt like the right way to use it. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday in June. They planned it together with the same approach they brought to everything, clear about what mattered, uninterested in what didn't, and in complete agreement that the ceremony should be theirs, not the town's, not conventions, not anyone else's idea of what it ought to be. Vivian Ashford came back from Denver when Lian wrote to tell her Rex had been arrested. She arrived on a Thursday 2 weeks before the wedding, and this time the meeting with Colt had none of the 3-year weight of the first. It was simply 2 people who had been connected by loss and were learning cautiously whether there was something else on the other side of that. "He'll be tried in Cheyenne," Vivian said over the kitchen table, a cup of tea between her hands. "The marshal wrote to me as well. Document forgery, extortion, in the federal case around the mineral rights." She paused. "They found records in his Denver office. He'd done it before, not with Colt's signature, but with others. There are other claims." She looked at Colt. "He's going to be in prison for a long time." Colt absorbed this with a nod. There was no satisfaction in his face, or not the loud kind, just the quiet relief of a conclusion. "Clara would have wanted this," Vivian said quietly, "for him to be stopped. She didn't know what he was when she left. She thought he was a way out. She found out what he actually was quickly enough." She set down her cup. "She wrote me once from Kansas, a single letter. She said she had made a terrible mistake, and she didn't know how to come back from it." Vivian's voice was even controlled, the voice of a woman who had made peace with this over 3 years and was not going to come apart at the kitchen table of a Wyoming ranch. "She died 6 weeks after that letter." The kitchen held the silence for a moment. "I'm sorry," Lian said. "Yes." Vivian looked at her and then at the kitchen itself. The clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the evidence of a place that had been cared for, and something in her expression shifted. "She would have liked you," she said to Lian. "Clara, she wanted warmth more than anything, a life that felt inhabited." She paused. "I think this place has that now." "It does," Colt said simply. Vivian stayed through the week. She helped with wedding preparations with the focused practicality of a Denver woman who had planned enough events to know which details mattered and which were negotiable. And she and Lian developed over that week the beginning of a friendship that was also a kind of inheritance, Two women connected by a man and a history finding each other across it. Lian made her wedding dress herself. Red silk, which she had ordered from San Francisco weeks earlier, embroidered at the cuffs and collar with gold thread in the pattern her mother had used for good occasions. A running border of small plum blossoms, because plum blossoms bloomed in winter, and her mother had always believed that anything capable of blooming in cold and dark deserved to be celebrated. The cut was American practical and modest, a traveling dress rather than a court gown. But the color and the embroidery were hers, were her mother's, were all the women before her mother who had marked important moments with red and gold. She finished it the evening before the wedding at the kitchen table in the new house with the lamp burning and the ranch hands having tactfully absented themselves to the bunkhouse, and Colt sitting across from her reading and occasionally looking up to watch her work with the steady, wondering attention she had come to understand was his particular expression of love. "You sew the way you cook," he said. She looked up. "With poor posture and constant second-guessing. With absolute certainty," he said. "Like the outcome is already known and you're just catching up to it." She looked at the dress in her hands, red silk and gold thread, and her mother's hands in every stitch, and thought, yes, the outcome has been known for a long time. I was just learning to believe it. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and brilliant. The sky, the deep, saturated blue of Wyoming in early summer. The meadow below the house vivid with wildflowers. The mountains stood clear and complete on the horizon. The air smelled like green things growing and the particular freshness of altitude after a cold spring. Lian dressed in the new house, the room that would be hers and Colt's, together with Vivian, doing the last buttons and making small, competent adjustments to the collar. The red silk caught the morning light and threw it back warm and particular. The jade piece from her father was at her throat on the chain she had been keeping it safe on for 3 years. "Ready?" Vivian asked. Lian looked at herself in the mirror, really looked in a way she rarely allowed because in 2 years of provisional living, she had learned to treat her own image as a logistical check rather than an occasion for consideration. She saw a woman in red silk and gold thread with her mother's posture and her grandmother's directness and her father's hope in her face. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." The ceremony was held on the porch of the new house, as they had planned, with the valley and the mountains as backdrop. The ranch hands arranged themselves in a loose arc on the grass below the steps, scrubbed and straightened, and wearing expressions of collective invested emotion that they were all working hard to manage with dignity. Finn was not working that hard. Cody had his hat in his hands and was using it to shield his face at intervals. The minister was a traveling man of plain and practical theology who had agreed upon reading the outline of what was wanted, that sometimes the truest wedding vows were the ones people wrote themselves. Colt was at the top of the porch steps when Lian came through the door. He was wearing a new suit, dark and clean, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at the plans for the house, with a focused, comprehensive attention, as though he was memorizing something he intended to keep. She walked to him and took his hands, and they stood together facing the minister and the assembled household in the mountains, and said the words they had written. "I promise," Colt said, "to see you clearly, not the version of you I need you to be, but the person you actually are. I promise to work beside you rather than ahead of you. I promise that this ranch, this house, this life, it is not something I am offering you. It is something we are building together, and I would not want it any other way." He paused, and she could see him finding the last words the way he found everything true, directly, without ornamentation. "I have been alone for a long time," he said, "and I am no longer willing to be." She pressed his hands. "I promise," Lian said, "to be honest with you even when honesty is difficult. To bring my whole self to this partnership, my knowledge, my grief, my courage, my stubbornness." She saw his mouth move. "Especially my stubbornness. I promise to plant things in this ground that will outlast both of us, and to cook for these men as long as they have the sense to stay, and to love you in the way my mother taught me, through attention, through care, through the daily choice to see someone fully and to decide they are worth the effort of being known." She paused. "I have carried my family's memory across an ocean and a continent and a great deal of difficulty," she said, "and I intend to carry it forward from here, in this place, in this life, in the children we will raise, who will know their names." Colt's hands tightened on hers. Yes, said the minister, and everyone on the grass below said something similar in their various and overlapping ways. The celebration lasted the rest of the day and well into the evening. Tables appeared in the yard. Someone had organized this while Lian was dressing a conspiracy. She discovered she had no complaints about, and they were laden with food from both traditions, her dumplings and spring rolls, and the rice dishes she had been teaching, the hands all winter, alongside barbecue beef and fresh cornbread and a strawberry pie that turned out to have been Finn's contribution, executed with visible anxiety and consumed with immediate enthusiasm. Vivian toasted them with the particular eloquence of a Denver woman who had attended many events and knew how to make a room feel something. An older hand produced a fiddle. Another found a harmonica. Music appeared in the warm air unannounced and welcome. Lion danced with Colt on the new porch in the golden evening light, the mountains going amber behind him, the music drifting up from below. He was not a graceful dancer. She was not either. They had agreed on this weeks earlier and had decided it was irrelevant. Happy, he said. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I am terrified and full of joy, and not certain I have ever felt anything this clearly in my life, she said. I think that is what happy feels like when it's real. That's exactly what it is, he said. They swayed together in the summer evening, and the ranch below them hummed with the sound of people celebrating, and the mountains held still at the horizon. And Lion thought, my grandmother taught me medicine, and my mother taught me cooking, and my father taught me that the jade was cold, but would warm to skin, and that the things you carried with care would keep you through the long, cold miles. They taught me everything I needed. I just had to come far enough to use it. Epilogue. She woke before dawn. This had not changed. It would probably never change the old habit of early rising built into her body by years of necessity and then kept by choice because she had learned that the hour before the rest of the world began was hers in a way no other hour was. A space for stillness, a space for the quiet work of being a person before the day required her to be useful. She rose without waking Colt and went to the kitchen of the new house, which was everything she had designed it to be: east-facing window morning light, coming in at an angle that caught the copper of the pots she had arranged on their hooks and turned them to small, warm suns. The stove was cold, and she built it up with the ease of long practice, listening to the fire come alive. She made coffee. She stood at the east window and watched the sky change. In Guangdong, the sky would be doing something different right now. A southern softness, a different quality of light. The sound of a village waking that was nothing like the sound of a ranch waking, and yet was somehow the same underneath. She carried both. She always would. Outside, the first birds began. A horse moved in the barn, a slow, contented shift of weight. The mountains became visible in stages as the light built first the suggestion of them against the sky, then the line of their ridges, then the full solid fact of them present and permanent in the way only mountains could be. Colt appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her, rumpled and warm with sleep, his dark eyes doing their familiar morning inventory that always ended the same way on her, with everything in his face that he had spent years keeping behind walls and had finally decided to let out. Early, he said. I know, she agreed. Coffee. He came in and took the cup she offered and stood beside her at the east window, looking out at the mountains and the brightening sky and the ranch that was theirs, the corrals, the barn, the bunkhouse where 10 men were sleeping who had chosen to stay in this difficult, beautiful place, and the house behind them that had been built with hope and was being filled with life. It's a good morning, he said. Yes, she said. She leaned against him slightly. He put his arm around her shoulders. They stood together at the window and watched the sun find its way over the mountains, and it painted everything gold and new, and the ranch woke slowly beneath it in Lian Zhao, who had crossed an ocean, who had survived the long, cold miles, who had planted a garden and built a life, and found in the brutal heart of a Wyoming winter the one thing she had not known she was looking for: let herself rest.